Is Caitlin Clark sending a message to Stephanie White, Amber Cox, Kelly Krauskopf, and the Indiana Fever? A message could be being delivered. Many people are speculating with this bold move.
Caitlin Clark just picked up a New York Liberty sneaker and showed it to the world. That is either a routine marketing obligation from a shoe deal that includes multiple colorways across multiple teams, or it is the most deliberate, most carefully timed, most publicly visible message a franchise player has ever sent to a front office that has spent months failing her in ways the entire sports world has been documenting in real time. The basketball universe is not treating it as routine. Fans who have been watching the Indiana Fever's coaching staff mishandle the most important player in the history of their franchise looked at that Liberty Edition CC1 promotion and immediately started reading between the lines.
SpaghettiOs. Caitlin Clark introducing the Statue of Liberty Edition, the New York Liberty Edition. I already know you damn near besties with Sabrina. We think you cool with Lexi. No, you go way back with Sabrina. Caitlin Clark could be sending a message to the Indiana Fever. Hey, I might not sign that epic. Y'all pushing everybody else for MVP. Stephanie White is having tantrums every time I shoot the ball. She's falling over herself on the sidelines. I don't have to deal with this. I can go elsewhere. And I think Caitlin Clark should seriously consider going elsewhere.
Clark's friendship with Sabrina Ionescu is documented and real. Her existing connections to the Liberty organization are not manufactured for content, and the reports that have been circulating about her inner circle's growing frustration with Indiana's front office dysfunction are not going away, regardless of how many carefully worded organizational statements get issued in response. Right now, the entire basketball world is asking the same question. Is Caitlin Clark sending a message to Stephanie White, Amber Cox, and everyone in the Indiana Fever organization who has spent this season failing to protect her? We are breaking down every layer of this developing story right now. The sneaker, the coaching betrayal, the Liberty's reported move, the commissioner's fury, and what happens to the entire WNBA if Indiana loses her. Start with what actually happened, because the facts of the promotion are more interesting than the summary version suggests. Clark promoted the New York Liberty edition of her CC1 signature sneaker. The colorway is unmistakably Liberty, the green and white palette that every basketball fan associates with the New York franchise sitting on a shoe that bears Clark's name and her brand identity.
Just has to do better, and we have to invest in those areas. The technology can get better. We can treat the referees a little bit better, pay them like they're full-time employees. I think things like that, and I think a lot has obviously come after that. And as I've stood up here and said before, like the harassment, the hate, none of that is okay. That goes for the opposing team we play. That goes for my teammates. That goes for my coaches. There should never be a question of character. Like I've always stood up here and said that, and that's truly what I believe. That's how I was raised. So, none of that is okay, and I don't want anybody to ever experience that. I think it can be really frustrating to me at times, and I think it's difficult. I think a lot of people sometimes think I'm a robot. I'm not a robot. I have emotions, I have feelings, and it can be really difficult to go through a lot of that. And, I'm 24 years old trying to navigate a lot, and I think at times I've been in this world for 4 years now, and you would never change any of it, but there are times that it is hard, and there are times that, it probably affects me a little bit more than I do put on, and, I would never change any of that for the world, but I think it's important that people do remember that part of it too, so.
The promotion was public, deliberately staged for maximum visibility, and delivered with the relaxed confidence of someone who understood exactly what they were holding up, and exactly what the audience receiving it was going to do with the image. The marketing reality is that signature sneaker lines for players of Clark's commercial profile typically include multiple team colorways. The Liberty Edition exists because New York is one of the league's most prominent franchises with one of its most engaged fan bases, and producing a Liberty colorway for the CC1 line is a straightforward commercial decision that has nothing inherently dramatic about it when examined in isolation. Shoe companies do this. Players promote the colorways their deals require them to promote. The business logic is transparent and unremarkable. But the sports world does not evaluate Clark's public moves in isolation anymore. It evaluates them in context.
I have to get to this. Shout out to ESP Ben, because he broke down the fact that Caitlyn is still being targeted and she's still not getting any calls from the referees, like at all. Like at all. It's really, really bad what's going on. And it's almost like Kathy's not, she's dropped the ball. We know she's dropped the ball. She's getting nothing done when it comes to this. Take a look at this here. Let me refresh this so we can get it going. Okay.
To her throat for the third straight game. She was out of rhythm because they hit her and fouled her this entire game. I got proof of everything. Watch this dirty crap. Caitlin Clark was getting hit, held. Shoot, she was getting tackled like a football player.
Yo, that's crazy right there.
And the context surrounding this specific promotion at this specific moment in a season defined by the Indiana Fever's repeated institutional failures to protect their franchise player is what turned a sneaker post into a national conversation about her future in Indiana. Her friendship with Sabrina Ionescu is not a recent development manufactured for the promotional cycle. It is a documented, genuine relationship between two of the best players in the women's game who have expressed mutual respect and personal connection across multiple seasons. Her existing connections within the Liberty organization extend beyond Ionescu. When Clark promotes Liberty gear while those connections are publicly known, and while reports about her frustration with Indiana are circulating across every platform covering the league, the audience watching does not separate the promotion from the context. It places them next to each other and asks what the combination means. The question the sneaker moment raised is not whether Clark is actively negotiating with New York. It is whether someone in her position, with her business sophistication, her documented frustration with Indiana's dysfunction, and her existing Liberty relationships, would choose this specific moment to make this specific promotion maximally visible if there were not at least some degree of intentionality behind the timing. The basketball world's answer to that question has been running at full volume since the image first circulated. To understand why the sneaker promotion landed with the force it did, you have to understand what Clark's relationship with the Indiana Fever coaching staff has actually looked like across this season, because the public record of that relationship is more damaging than the most critical outside commentary has fully captured. Stephanie White's handling of the Deja Carrington incidents established the foundational grievance. When Carrington delivered a flagrant 2 on Sophie Cunningham and got ejected, White went to the podium and said she did not oppose the hard foul. She said she did not believe it was intentional. She defended the player who had just been ejected for dangerous contact at the direct expense of her own roster's physical safety and the dignity of the player who absorbed the hit. The revision that arrived 3 days later, claiming she had not seen the play in real time despite broadcast footage showing her eyes tracking it from start to finish.
But the New York Liberty could be in Caitlin Clark's future as she is promoting the New York Liberty Statue of Liberty ones, CC ones.
Did not repair the credibility damage the original defense had created. It compounded it by adding the specific problem of a coach whose account of her own direct experience contradicted what the camera recorded her doing in real time. When the Alyssa Thomas throat punch happened and White finally delivered the unambiguous condemnation the situation required, egregious, crazy, dangerous, absolutely unacceptable, the contrast with her Carrington response was so stark that it raised the question of why one incident had produced such different institutional instincts than the other. The answer that most observers settled on pointed directly at the personal coaching relationship between White and Carrington at Connecticut as the variable that explained the asymmetry. That explanation does not make either response more defensible when examined from Clark's perspective inside the same organization. The injury report allegations add a layer that goes beyond coaching judgment into organizational trust. Reports circulating suggest that the Indiana Fever's communications around player health and playing time have not been characterized by the transparency that players at Clark's level reasonably expect from their employing organization. The specific claim that healthy players have been managed under the pretense of medical limitations as a method of controlling playing time and public narrative is a serious allegation that touches the foundation of the player-organization relationship. When a player cannot trust that the information her organization is releasing about her own body reflects reality, the organizational trust required to make a long-term commitment becomes very difficult to sustain. Clark herself has said publicly that she is not a robot, that she has emotions, that some of what she goes through affects her more than she lets on. Those words from someone who has maintained extraordinary public composure across 2 professional seasons of sustained pressure carry significant weight.
The Indiana Fever, they're not honest about any injuries ever. So, we can't necessarily look for transparency through them at all. It'd be a complete waste of time to look for transparency through the Indiana Fever's organization when it comes down to the injury of Aaliyah Boston. So,
when the most composed player in the league tells reporters that things are harder than she shows and that she is a 24-year-old navigating more than most people in her position ever have to navigate, the people in the building responsible for making her environment better, rather than harder, have to examine honestly whether they have been doing that. The coaching staff's failures exist inside a broader organizational context that the front office owns responsibility for. And the front office's handling of this season's accumulated controversies suggests an institutional structure that has not been adequate to the specific demands of managing the most prominent player in women's sports history. Amber Cox and the Indiana Fever leadership inherited a franchise that Clark transformed from a commercial afterthought into a national sports story within her first professional season. The attendance numbers, the television ratings, the sponsorship interest, the media rights valuation, all of it moved in one direction from the moment Clark was drafted, and all of it traces back to one player's presence and performance. The organizational responsibility that comes with managing a player whose individual impact on the franchise's commercial trajectory is that direct and that documented is proportionally larger than anything the Indiana front office had previously been required to manage. The evidence across this season suggests the response to that responsibility has not matched its scale. The coach whose public statements about player safety incidents required multiple revisions under public pressure is still coaching. The officiating pattern that has seen Clark absorb documented physical contact without whistle responses has not generated the kind of sustained, visible advocacy from the front office that the situation warrants. The reports about injury management transparency have not produced public accountability from organizational leadership, and the fan base that has been watching all of these failures accumulate has been demanding responses that have arrived slowly, partially, and calibrated to managing external pressure rather than genuinely addressing the underlying problems. The league office's reported involvement adds a dimension that goes beyond Indiana's internal management. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert's office reportedly requesting urgent answers from the Indiana front office about how its coaching staff has managed to alienate the sport's most recognizable player signals, that the dysfunction has reached a level visible enough to concern the organization that governs the league. Clark's presence has been commercially transforming. When league headquarters is asking a franchise why its generational talent is reportedly considering her options, the conversation has moved past the threshold of internal organizational management into the territory of institutional crisis. The fan base's response to the accumulated failures has been proportionate to what has accumulated: calls for coaching staff terminations, demands for front office accountability. The specific frustration of watching an organization that should be doing everything possible to make Clark's environment better appear to be doing the opposite through a combination of poor judgment, inadequate advocacy, and institutional communication that prioritizes protecting organizational relationships over protecting the player those relationships are supposed to serve. The New York Liberty's reported interest in Clark is not a spontaneous reaction to this season's controversies. It reflects an organizational intelligence operation that has been tracking the Indiana situation and identifying the precise moment when the combination of Clark's frustration, Indiana's dysfunction, and the WNBA's free agency structure creates an opportunity that a sophisticated front office can move on. Chris DeMarco's public comments about Clark, Subtle, carefully worded, but pointed enough that the basketball community registered them immediately, communicated exactly what the Liberty wanted to communicate without creating the kind of explicit tampering situation that league rules are designed to prevent. When an executive of his profile makes remarks that reference what a player of Clark's caliber deserves in terms of market size, coaching quality, and organizational support, the subtext is not subtle to anyone familiar with how sports organizations communicate around acquisition targets they cannot approach directly. What New York offers that Indiana has demonstrably failed to provide exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The market is the most obvious. New York is the largest sports media market in the country, with a broadcast infrastructure, sponsorship ecosystem, and cultural platform that Indiana cannot match regardless of how well the Fever organization performs across any other organizational dimension. A player of Clark's commercial profile in a New York jersey, playing in a building that accommodates the kind of live event experience her fan base has demonstrated it will pay for, generates a commercial trajectory that makes Indiana's current situation look like a starting point rather than a ceiling. The coaching dimension is where the Liberty's pitch makes its most direct case against Indiana's current situation. New York's organizational structure has not been characterized by the kind of public credibility failures that have defined Indiana's coaching staff narrative this season. The contrast between what DeMarco's organization offers in terms of player support and what White's coaching staff has demonstrated it provides is a selling point that does not require explicit articulation to be effective. Anyone who has watched this season's press conference record already understands the contrast. The reports that Sophie Cunningham has been included in broader discussions about Indiana's situation signal that the Liberty may be thinking about this as a package rather than a singular acquisition. Clark and Cunningham as a unit have demonstrated commercial chemistry that transcends individual player value. They are a franchise foundation that drives attendance, media interest, and cultural engagement simultaneously. A front office sophisticated enough to recognize that Clark's market value extends beyond her individual statistics to the ecosystem she creates around herself would logically pursue the full ecosystem rather than just the central element of it. The scenario developing around Clark's relationship with Indiana is not a typical trade rumor story that league headquarters can monitor from a comfortable distance while the market works itself out through normal competitive processes. It is a direct threat to the commercial infrastructure the WNBA has been building on the foundation of Clark's presence, and the commissioner's office is reportedly treating it with the urgency that threat deserves. The media rights deals the WNBA has been negotiating with Disney, Amazon, and NBC are built around a specific commercial narrative: the Clark era, the unprecedented viewership growth, the attendance records, the cultural breakthrough that has made women's basketball a genuine mainstream sports conversation for the first time in the league's history. Every number in those negotiations reflects what Clark's presence in the league has produced. Every dollar being committed by broadcast partners represents a bet on the continuation of what she has built. And every element of Indiana's dysfunction that makes her departure more plausible is a direct threat to the credibility of the projections those negotiations are built around. Engelbert's office reportedly requesting urgent answers from Indiana's front office is the institutional signal that the commissioner understands the stakes. This is not a situation where the league can allow normal organizational dynamics to play out on their own timeline while the media rights window remains open. The timeline for those negotiations and the timeline for Clark's relationship with Indiana to either stabilize or collapse are running simultaneously, and the intersection of those two timelines creates a pressure dynamic that the league's leadership cannot afford to treat as someone else's problem to solve. The fury attributed to the commissioner's office reflects the specific frustration of watching an institutional crisis develop inside the organization that is supposed to be stewarding the league's most commercially valuable asset. Indiana's coaching staff failures, front office communication problems, and the accumulated public narrative of an organization failing its franchise player are not just that franchise's problem, they are the league's problem, because the league's commercial future is directly dependent on the player those failures are reportedly pushing toward considering her options. The nightmare scenario for league headquarters is not difficult to construct. Clark concludes that Indiana's dysfunction is irresolvable within a time frame that makes staying viable. The Liberty's offer materializes into something concrete. Clark makes a decision that removes the question from everyone else's hands. The media rights negotiations lose their primary selling point in the middle of the most commercially sensitive period in the league's history. Every number built around the Clark era gets revised downward by broadcast partners who were paying for something that is no longer reliably in the package they were buying. Underneath the coaching failures, the front office dysfunction, and the Liberty interest sits a foundational grievance that has been documented across the entire season and that Indiana's organizational response has consistently failed to address with the visibility and urgency it deserves. Clark has been hit across consecutive games in documented, filmed, publicly available footage that shows contact to her throat, her neck, her arms on drives, and her body through screens being absorbed without whistle responses from officiating crews working those games with direct sightlines to the contact. The incidents involving Carrington, Thomas, and multiple others throughout the season have produced a documented pattern that is no longer deniable as random officiating inconsistency. It is a pattern that points in a specific direction across enough separate incidents and enough different officiating crews that the pattern itself has become the story rather than any individual missed call. The front office's advocacy for Clark through this pattern has been inadequate. The coaching staff's public response to incidents involving their own player has ranged from actively counterproductive, the Carrington defense, to appropriately strong, the Thomas post-game condemnation, without producing the kind of sustained, consistent organizational pressure on the league office that a franchise player being repeatedly targeted without adequate officiating protection deserves from the organization employing her. Kathy Engelbert's handling of the officiating pattern has not generated the confidence that the situation warrants. The league's communications around missed calls, flagrant foul reviews, and the broader standard of protection being applied to Clark across the season have been reactive and calibrated to managing the specific incident in front of the league at any given moment, rather than addressing the systemic pattern those incidents collectively document. The referee accountability argument, that officials working at the professional level should be held to standards that include consequences for documented pattern failures in high-profile situations, has not received a response from league headquarters that matches the seriousness of what the pattern represents. From Clark's perspective inside the organization that is supposed to be her advocate, the combination of a coaching staff that has failed to consistently and immediately defend her, a front office that has not generated visible sustained pressure on the league office about her protection, and a league office whose response to the officiating pattern has been inadequate, that combination creates an environment where the organizational support that a franchise player has every right to expect is not reliably present when the situations requiring it arise. The most important evidence about Clark's actual state of mind does not come from the reports circulating about Liberty offers or front office dysfunction. It comes from her own words in press conference settings across this season. And those words deserve to be read with the care that any honest attempt to understand what she is actually experiencing requires. She said she is not a robot. She said she has emotions and feelings. She said that some of what she goes through affects her more than she lets on publicly. She said she is a 24-year-old navigating things that most people in her position have never had to navigate. She said there are times when it is hard. She said it in a tone that communicated the specific exhaustion of someone who has been maintaining extraordinary public composure for an extended period, while the private experience underneath that composure has been significantly more difficult than the composed exterior suggests. Those words from that specific person in that specific context are worth sitting with carefully. Clark's public persona across 2 professional seasons has been defined by composure under pressure that analysts and commentators have consistently described as remarkable, given the specific nature and volume of the pressures she has been operating under. She does not escalate controversies in public settings. She does not use press conference platforms to air grievances about officiating, coaching decisions, or organizational failures in the direct way that the situations she has encountered would have justified. She answers questions honestly, and then lets the conversation move on to the next subject. When a player with that specific public discipline tells reporters that she is not a robot and that things are harder than she shows, The honest read of those words is that something significant is being communicated through language that is still carefully chosen to avoid creating the specific kind of story that more direct expression would produce. She is not saying she wants to leave Indiana. She is not confirming reports about liberty interest or front office dysfunction. She is saying, with the measured precision that characterizes everything she says publicly, that the human being inside the franchise player is carrying weight that the franchise player's exterior does not fully reflect. That communication deserves a specific response from the organization employing her. The response it deserves is not a press release about organizational commitment or a coaching statement about team unity. The response it deserves is concrete change in the specific areas where the weight she is carrying has been generated by organizational failures that are within Indiana's control to address. The commercial consequences of a Clark departure from Indiana, whether through free agency, a trade scenario, or any other mechanism that results in her playing in a different jersey, are not speculative projections. They are the straightforward arithmetic of removing the variable that has been driving every positive commercial number the league has produced over the last 2 seasons. The media rights negotiations currently in progress would be the first and most immediate casualty. The numbers being discussed with Disney, Amazon, and NBC reflect the Clark era's commercial trajectory, the attendance growth, the viewership records, the sponsorship expansion, the cultural conversation that has made the WNBA a genuine mainstream sports property for the first time in its history. Those numbers are projections built on the assumption that the player generating them continues generating them. A Clark departure mid-negotiation does not just reduce the numbers, it calls into question the entire commercial narrative being used to justify them, and broadcast partners paying for a specific product have every right to reassess their commitment when the primary ingredient of that product changes. The players whose improved compensation futures depend on the media rights deal landing at the numbers currently being discussed would feel the downstream effects of that reassessment in ways that translate directly into their own financial futures. The new collective bargaining agreement, the improved salary structures, the revenue-sharing improvements that have been part of the league's commitment to its players, all of those depend on the media rights deal delivering the numbers that Clark's presence is being used to justify. Her departure makes those numbers less certain and the commitments built on them less secure. The Indiana Fever specifically would face a commercial reversal that organizational leadership has apparently not fully reckoned with in its management decisions. The franchise that Clark transformed from a commercial afterthought into a national sports story would revert towards something closer to its pre-Clark identity at a speed that reflects how completely her presence has been the driver of the transformation. The attendance numbers, the local sponsorship interest, the television ratings for Fever games, the cultural engagement around the franchise, all of it traces back to one variable, and removing that variable produces consequences at the speed that markets process the removal of their primary driver. The question of whether Indiana can preserve its partnership with Clark has a specific answer that requires examining what concrete changes would need to happen and whether the organizational will to make them exists within a time frame that matters. A full coaching staff overhaul represents the minimum viable response to what the public record of this season documents. The credibility damage from the Carrington press conference sequence, the sideline footage contradiction, the pattern of responses that prioritized protecting personal relationships over defending the franchise player, that damage is attached to specific people making specific decisions in specific moments. The organizational message that a coaching change sends, that the failures have been identified, ownership taken, and the people responsible replaced with people committed to the different approach Clark's situation requires, is the only message that begins to address the specific grievance the coaching staff's conduct has created. Front office accountability requires more than coaching staff changes. It requires public acknowledgement that the organizational communication around player health and playing time has not met the transparency standard that players at Clark's level are entitled to expect. It requires visible, sustained advocacy from organizational leadership on the officiating pattern that has been documented throughout the season. And it requires a demonstrated commitment to those changes that extends across time rather than arriving as a reactive response to public pressure and then fading as the immediate controversy subsides. The league office stepping in with visible officiating reform would provide external validation that the environment Clark is operating in is changing in response to documented concerns rather than in response to the specific pressure any individual game or incident generates. A league that has been reactive to officiating pattern criticism rather than proactive about the pattern itself needs to demonstrate through concrete action, not communication strategy, that the protection standard being applied to its most important player is being taken seriously at the institutional level that can make that standard real. Whether all of those changes arrive within the time frame that Clark's reported frustration requires is the question that Indiana's leadership needs to be asking with genuine urgency rather than treating as something that can be managed through the normal pace of organizational decision-making. The Liberty's interest is reportedly real, the offer being discussed is reportedly significant, and the window for Indiana to make the case that staying is better than leaving is not unlimited. What the New York Liberty sneaker promotion revealed is not necessarily a commitment to leaving Indiana. It revealed the specific vulnerability of an organization that has spent a season creating the conditions under which leaving becomes thinkable for a player who had every reason to stay. Clark came to Indiana as a player who wanted to win a championship, build something lasting, and prove herself in the league she grew up watching. She has delivered on her end of that partnership beyond any reasonable projection. The attendance records, the television ratings, the commercial transformation, the cultural moment that has made women's basketball a genuine mainstream conversation. What Indiana's coaching staff and front office have delivered in return has been documented in press conference sequences that the sports world watched unfold in real time, in officiating pattern failures that the organization has not addressed with the urgency the pattern requires, and in organizational communication that has prioritized managing narratives over building the trust that long-term partnerships between franchise players and their organizations are built upon. The Liberty's reported interest is the market responding to an opportunity that Indiana's dysfunction created. DeMarco's organization did not manufacture the conditions that made Clark's situation in Indiana complicated. Indiana's coaching staff and front office manufactured those conditions through a series of decisions whose cumulative effect has reportedly pushed the most important player in the history of the franchise to the point where a $1,000 sneaker promotion becomes a national conversation about her future. The next few weeks will tell us whether Indiana's leadership has the organizational self-awareness and the institutional will to make the changes that the situation requires, or whether the Liberty's reported offer will become the story that defines what this season ultimately meant for the franchise that was handed the greatest gift in the history of women's professional basketball and spent a season failing to protect it. Tell us in the comments, does Clark stay in Indiana if the coaching staff changes, or has the damage already reached the point where the Liberty's offer becomes inevitable regardless of what Indiana does next?